Session 3, titled Economic Security and the Role of the Private Sector, will now begin. This session will be moderated by Mr. Rexon Ryu from the Asia Group. Mr. Ryu, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Rexon Ryu. I'm with the Asia Group, and I'm pleased to be moderating the third panel today, titled Economic Security and the Role of the Private Sector. Like the topics for every other panel, this is an incredibly broad topic that spans a significant historical set of accomplishments in the area of trade and deepening economic relationships overall. And as we've heard from a number of our speakers, including I think almost every speaker during our opening ceremony, an evolution in priorities beyond trade to technology and emerging and critical industries. I'm pleased to moderate a panel that has a wealth of diverse experience, backgrounds, policymakers, thought leaders, industry executives, and I will attempt to pursue as many lines of conversation as possible. We'll go down the order, down the row here in terms of order of speakers, and I will introduce each of you and ask you to give your opening remarks. Our first speaker today is Kim Jong-un. He is currently the chairman of the board of SK Innovation. And previously, he served as the longest-serving Minister of Trade for South Korea from 2007 to 2011. During his tenure, he concluded free trade agreements with India, the EU, Peru, and perhaps most importantly for our conversation, the United States. He was the chief negotiator of the Chorus FTA from 2006 to 2007. And he was also a member of the National Assembly elected in 2012. Mr. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rexon. Thank you very much. First of all, my thanks to Asan Institute to have this opportunity to think about economic and trade relations between our two countries. Well, when you say 140 years, that means we have to date back to 1882, and many previous speakers touched upon that point. But my view of that year, because it is conspicuous. Why conspicuous? That was the year then Korea, Yi Dynasty, concluded the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation. And that treaty was the first one that Korea has concluded with one Western country. So US was the first. But actually, when I say Western country, but 6 years earlier, in 1876, we concluded a similar treaty with Japan. Here I would like to say there's a quite one similarity between the two treaties, while there are, in my view, at least two striking differences between the two. If I start with the similarity, of course, both treaties were the product of what you call gunboat diplomacy of the 19th century. And here I remember my reading of a history textbook. In that century, if goods cannot cross over the border, then the army does. That was what a previous speaker said. That was the century of imperialism. This gunboat diplomacy, either from United States or Japan, was to open Korea, which was called at that time Hermit Kingdom, as described by an American author named, I remember, William Griffiths. Japan really, tried to copy the strategy what United States has done to open Japan, earlier. But here again, there's a similarity and difference. Similarity is they sending ships to open another country, but the difference is the way they conduct, the way they try to contact the local officials. So if I move over to the striking difference, number one, the one with Japan was concluded in a very coercive circumstances. There was a rattling saber around the negotiating table and even signing table. And that was a very unilateral. While the other one, I mean, the one we concluded with the United States, in my reading, it will be interesting to know there's not a few kind of reciprocity there. And even we have an MFN clause. And actually, you know, a friend who is very good at Korean history told me the other day that at that time, Korean local officials even didn't understand what most favored nation treatment means. So there was a advice and teaching from China, and China did that. And they really advised to make a good treatment with the United States. But why China did that? In my sense, there is not a kind of friendly persuasion, but it's to check Japan, who exercised the utmost influence on Korea at that time. Well, anyhow, the contrast here, the first difference is unilateral encroachment or coercive versus kind of a persuasive approach and reciprocity. Move over to second point of difference is the one we made with the United States only lasted less than 20 years, exactly 18 years. Why? It got invalidated when Korea lost its sovereignty due to another treaty we made with Japan. That means Korea's annexation by Japan in 1910. So that treaty, terminated. But the one with Japan, the treaty succeeded by another treaty, as I told you, which annexed Korea. And here, I'd like to emphasize, although this is a story about a century ago, what is very important in the Korean history, in the Korean mindset of Korean people is the opening of the nation, after a great deal of hesitation, finally ended up with loss of sovereignty, get annexed by some other foreign power. And such kind of a terrible and triste, very sad historical memory lingered and stayed in deep side of the Korean people's mind. Century. And even some of the sentiment still remains in our mind. But let me tell you here, there were several events in our course of economic development, but I dare to say Chorus FTA was a landmark occasion for us to wash off such kind of sentiment, quote and unquote, fear to open, and again, quote and unquote, shy to compete. So Chorus FTA, not only in its substance, but in historical sense, it really sent a big messages to Korean people. We can open for competition. And it marked 10th anniversary of its entry into force this year. And either side, US and Korea all together said this has been a win-win product. Well, having said that, during the course of industrialization in early 60s and even till 70s, there's a great deal of helps from United States in many forms, like grants, loans, and sometimes technical assistance, and even education at home and abroad. Abroad means stateside. And that really helped Korea. In the 80s, when Korean economy grew quite a lot, and there's a familiar cliche among Korean people, something like Section 301 dispute, Special 301 dispute, or Super 301 disputes. So that one decade in 80s, or even early part of 90s, was 301 whatever. Ordinary 301, Special 301, Super 301. That's the area of disputes with the United States. Up until we concluded Chorus FTA finally in 2007. Well, having said that, throughout the course of industrialization, what is really foremost importance in my mind is Korean people learn by experience and through the relationship with the United States came to realize the real value of a market economy and liberal democracy. So I think throughout our 140 years of friendship, the foremost importance of that relationship which brought us was the value of liberal democracy and market economy, I think. Well, now we have a new administration, set sail last month, and President Biden has visited 2 weeks ago. And my take of the statement between the two presidents was really excellent, and they touched everything. And if I focused on economic areas, they talked about bilateral cooperations on very critically important areas like semiconductor, batteries for EVs, nuclear energies, supply chain, and something else. I cannot remember every one of them. But to realize all these cooperations, they agreed to set up economic security dialogue in respective NSC. So this is a real excellent agreement between the two presidents. That was on bilateral dimension. But in regional dimensions, Korea decided to join IPEF or IPEF. Well, I think this is course of matter. That's what I wanted, really. Some people really, worried about kind of, what can I say, probable reaction from Beijing. But, let me stop here. And if there's any questions on me on that point, then I would be ready to ask or deliver my view on that point. Thank you, Rexon.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Our next speaker will be Wendy Cutler, who is Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Managing Director of the Washington, D.C. office. As many of you know, she has served with great distinction for nearly 30 years as a diplomat and negotiator in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, including serving as the acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative and negotiating the Chorus FTA and TPP on behalf of the U.S. government. Wendy, the floor is yours to build on Mr. Kim's sort of masterful framing in a very brief period of much of the history and several salient observations to maybe bring us forward to some of the key events today, including as how you reflect on them having negotiated Chorus. So Wendy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Rex. And for me, it's really great to be back in Korea after COVID. It's been a long time. And then to be on a panel with so many colleagues, and particularly Kim Jong-un. We spent 2 very intense years together negotiating Chorus, even if it was in our mutual shared interest in this hotel.
Yeah.
There was a lot of ups and downs in the Chorus negotiation. But when I think of the 140 years, of course, I haven't done my homework, and I can't go back as far as Mr. Kim has. But I'd like to think that Chorus FTA was a very important turning point in U.S.-Korea relations. Because really, up until then, when you looked at our economic and trade relationship, as Mr. Kim has mentioned, it was full of friction. And it wasn't until Chorus where we both kind of realized for our own reasons that it was in our mutual interest to pursue a free trade agreement together. And there were a lot of doubters in my country, in Korea, and all over the world. But by working together intensely towards a shared goal, we were able to achieve success. We recently celebrated the 10-year anniversary of Chorus, and I was heartened to hear from both sides really praise for the agreement. Trade has dramatically increased, Foreign direct investment has dramatically increased. Our trade tensions have turned into trade cooperation. And our businesses have developed relationships that have allowed for technological breakthrough and a lot of joint projects and joint initiatives. But now, I think we're at another turning point, particularly in our economic relationship. And that is, it's no longer the bilateral issues that we should be focusing on. It's our shared interest in pursuing regional and global issues. And here, that's where I think the Indo-Pacific economic framework comes into play. The US and Korea, we have a lot of shared interests with respect to the values and visions we see for the world and for the region. And I think IPEF allows us to work cooperatively together with other countries to bring those values and vision into very practical outcomes for the region. Now, that's not to say there are not going to be a lot of challenges with IPEF, and we're already hearing a lot of criticism and some skepticism. I mean, I hear from many of our Asian friends questions like, what's in it for us? You've taken tariff cuts and market access off the table. That's what we depend on in order to be able to respond to some of your other requests. I've heard friends and colleagues say, well, how can we even trust you given that in 2 years you're going to have another presidential election, and who knows if the next administration will even continue this initiative. And furthermore, there are questions about what we're even asking the other countries to do. We have established 4 pillars of work, including trade, resilient supply chains, decarbonization, and tax and anti-corruption. But beyond that, we've been pretty quiet on the details. And I think the details will come out in the coming weeks and within a couple of months as we work with the other 13 countries that have signed on to this initiative to scope out the details so the actual negotiations can begin. Korea was a founding member of the IPEF, one of the 12 countries that joined President Biden just a couple of weeks ago in Asia when this was announced. That was very welcomed by Washington. And when I look at IPEF, which I really believe needs to succeed because the US needs to be economically engaged in the region, I think Korea is going to be a pivotal partner in helping us achieve success. I have 4 suggestions on how Korea can help the IPEF move forward. But first, I just want to address kind of the one criticism I keep hearing of IPEF in Korea, and that is this an anti-China initiative? And what I tell my friends is, you don't see the word China at all in IPEF, and you're not going to see it as the pillars, the details of the pillars are developed. The administration's been very careful about making this an affirmative, positive agenda of the vision and values and the rules that the region should adopt and pursue. Now, with respect to how Korea can help, I think first on the content and on the details, because they need to be worked out. Korea brings incredible amount of expertise to the issue of supply chains, being a major producer of semiconductors and batteries, and a country that is very dependent on value chains and supply chains throughout the region and the world. Second, I think for IPEF to be credible, we'll need to see kind of early results, what we call early harvest, early outcomes. And I think here, Korea can work with us, particularly in the supply chain area, to put together such things like an early warning mechanism whereby the countries participating in IPEF can alert others to early on to potential shortages, potential vulnerabilities, in order to head them off before they become a crisis. third, given Korea's extensive relations with countries in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia and South Asia, I think Seoul is going to be instrumental in helping us persuade these countries to join the pillars of IPEF, but also to help us bring on new participants. And finally, for this initiative to succeed, we're going to have to show the other countries that there's something in it for them. And again, the US, whether folks like it or not, and there's a lot of criticism here, we're not going to be cutting tariffs, US tariffs, and we're not going to be asking other countries to cut their tariffs. And I know for a lot of people that's just, hard to accept. But what I would posit, I think there are other incentives and opportunities that can be brought to the table, and I would hope that Korea would help us with respect to such items as capacity building and technical assistance that we provided to Korea, as Mr. Kim mentioned, in the 1970s. Korea is doing an amazing job providing technical assistance and capacity building to countries around the region and the world. Also, I think through public-private partnerships, there's a lot that can be done, which will help a number of these countries attract more foreign direct investment, something that they highly value. So when I look at IPEF, again, I'm very heartened to see that Korea was a founding member, and I hope that we can work with Korea constructively to bring this initiative to a successful outcome. And I'll just conclude and just say, I think success is critical here. The United States needs to be economically engaged and play a leadership role in this region, and IPEF is the vehicle for doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cutler. Thank you for bringing the IPEF initiative and the current regional trade and economic agenda into our conversation today. Third, we have Dr. Chung Chol. Dr. Chung is the Senior Research Fellow at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. He is also Vice Chair of the Korea National Committee for Pacific Economic Cooperation and Vice President of the Korean Association of Trade and Industry Studies. Previously, he was the Chief Economist of the Korea International Trade Association in Washington, D.C., where he helped ratify the KORUS FTA. Dr. Chung, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Can you hear that? Okay. I'd like to thank Asan Institute for the organizing this wonderful symposium. And with the previous speakers, I agree that the KORUS FTA is a milestone in the history of the 140 years of the relationship between Korea and the United States. And I think the FTA was very well balanced thanks to the former Trade Minister Kim and the former Deputy STR Wendy. I think the Wendy Cutler is one of the most famous American women in Korea because of this the importance of the KORUS FTA and lots of the debates in Korea about this. So with the long and the hard negotiation and ratification process, finally we made this deal. I think this is a very, very good framework to work together and the very good channel to communicate with each other. And as we all know that this year is the 10th anniversary of the KORUS FTA, which entered into effect in 2012. Now the trade and economic landscape is quite different from 10 years ago. So even though we have this very well-balanced negotiation in the KORUS FTA, I think we need the cooperation, maybe more important than the negotiation. It's not just about cooperation, it's more about the well-designed cooperation between the two countries. Because there are lots of challenges ahead of us, like the global value chain disruptions, and the multilateral trading system in crisis, and the digital transformation, climate change, and so on. So, as both speakers also mentioned, IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is the economic framework in the region, has just started. But then we have the issue, like the title of this session, economic security. I'd like to bring your attention to the Professor Gary Pisano of the Harvard Business School. He talks about the industrial commons, right? It is basically R&D and manufacturing infrastructure, know-how, process development skills, and engineering capabilities coming from the clustering of universities, suppliers, manufacturers in industries such as semiconductor and the biotechnologies. So I think the reason why this industrial common, regeneration of industrial commons in the United States is critical, according to him, because the innovative capabilities are critical to maintaining industrial leadership that are being threatened and need defending. I think that's where the economic security notion comes from. And over the years when there was the globalization and free trade, then the global value chain expansion was not driven by the policymakers. It was driven by the market. So the companies went wherever the cost is the lowest. But they ignored this sort of the industrial commons. So I think it's time to rebuild this industrial commons, not just in the United States, but maybe using this framework of the IPEF together, maybe Korea and US can regenerate the industrial commons. I think that's my suggestion to Wendy. Wendy suggested 4 things. I just asked just one, because this innovation industries are very, very important, and as you know that with the start of the new Korean government, and after the meeting between the President Biden and President Yoon, the Korean private sector, big companies announced huge investment plans in semiconductor, biotechnology, and so on, over the $1 trillion for the next 5 years. It's not a simple coincidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. Anthony Kim is our next speaker, and I think he will build on some of the comments to assess and evaluate this question of role of government and the role of the private sector in the challenges we face today. Mr. Kim is a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where he manages the Index of Economic Freedom. He's also manager of global engagement for the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Previously, he served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Dr. Edwin Follner, the founder of the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Kim?
Thank you, Rexon. And congrats and many thanks to Asan Institute for convening this timely gathering. If I may, given my 5 minutes, I'll try to be precise at 4 minutes, 25 seconds. So let me try that. I think this session's title, Economic Security and the Role of the Private Sector, allow me to take slightly different path from our distinguished previous 3 speakers. I just want to simply share 3 parameters or factors for our discussions and for your further thinking. Number 1, I think economic security is national security more than ever. And they are now dependent on each other. Without economic security, you cannot really have sustainable national security. Why do I say that? Pandemic and February 24, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think we are really going through tectonic shift in terms of geopolitical, geostrategic setting. I think it's important for us to think about where we are at this particular juncture, to think through the US-Korea alliance and beyond. So my first point is that this is really never seen before. And let's be candid. China and Russia, they have been weaponizing security. So energy security was very much a big issue nowadays in Europe. Russia has been using that as a weapon. China, not an exception. They've been doing a lot of economic tools as weapons to global expansion, their ambition. And Belt and Road is one of the clear examples. However, they can be diplomatic and all. So security, economic security, and national security. Here, national security I mean by a bit more like a military security and more conventional sense. But now they are dependent on each other. So my second point is that what does that mean? That means basically our ecosystem, trade and investment in particular, it's been changed. I don't think we can go back to those years of heights of globalization anytime soon. I mean, this is still young 21st century, but we've been going through a lot of crises. Security crisis in 2001. About 10 years later, we had a global financial crisis. And then another 10 years later, we had this pandemic, COVID. And now all of a sudden, we have this never seen before, Russia's unprovoked, brutal invasion of a sovereign nation. Now, I think we got to do something, right? But the question becomes, where do we start? So in my humble view, I like to say we need to build up 3 I's, meaning ideas, individuals who can actually pursue those ideas and execute those ideas, and eventually institutions. I'm not talking about another multilateral regional institutions, but let's build better institutions at home and abroad. I'm not talking about nation building operation at all. The problem with China, and more specifically CCP, we have problems with their ideas and institutions, and even people. Look at Xi Jinping. He's the king. So we got to work on 3 I's, individuals, ideas, and institutions. And this is time to act on how to build strong and effective 3 I's to get to where we want to be. My third point is that, so Indo-Pacific framework, economic framework, and Indo-Pacific, this is one of the theaters. And I just want to say this is a great theater for US-Korea partnership, alliance, partnership, relationship, however you put it. But in my humble view, I think US-Korea relationship really symbolizes how to utilize economic security and national security all together. The relationship between Washington and Seoul, it has been really about advancing economic security and national security through the role of the private sector, enhanced role and partnership. So I think this is time to go beyond the Indo-Pacific theater, if I may, particularly in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. To me, ultimately, the whole Ukraine tragedy will be reconstruction process. And think about the technological capacity and economic capacity that South Korea has and shares with many other countries, but particularly with the United States. So this is time for us to think a bit more rather than confined by this theater we are very used to in the Pacific. This theater in Europe, there's an initiative called 3Cs Initiative. I think some of our European colleagues will recognize it. This is really about advancing infrastructure and connectivity and energy security. I think Korea is a perfect partner in terms of advancing this initiative in Europe. This is not just European Union 12 members of the European Union, and then 3 seas, Baltic Seas, Adriatic Sea, and Black Seas. But this is also a matter of Washington, especially in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, we got to act together and we got to work together. That's how we build security together. So my concluding point is that this is really time to go beyond our Indo-Pacific theater, and let's try to advance our collective mindset. Like-minded, willing partners should work together at times like this. And I think South Korea presents unique partnership, not only for the United States, but our allies and partners in Europe. So I just want to share those points because economic security matters more than ever, and economic security is national security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. You helped bring I think, a sharper focus on some of the topics we want to explore, particularly the critical relevance of what's in the title, as you said, economic security. And you also mentioned the very clear role of the private sector and private industry. And that leads us to our next speaker, Mr. No Jung-won. Mr. No Jung-won is the president and chief marketing officer of SK Hynix, the world's second largest memory chip maker and third largest semiconductor company. At SK Hynix, he is responsible for sales and marketing, corporate strategy, and corporate development. He previously led major acquisitions for SK Hynix, including Intel's NAND business division and Toshiba Memory Corporation. Mr. No, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your introduction to me. Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Jong-won No, one of presidents of SK Hynix. I am very honored for the invitation to represent SK Hynix to provide a viewpoint from semiconductor industry in this prestigious symposium. As you may know, SK Hynix is one of global leader in semiconductor industry. Our industry is at the forefront of economic security policy debates. And for many policymakers, the first industry that comes to mind in economic security discussions. Actually, the reason for that is quite obvious. Semiconductors are the fundamental technology for global economy. The car that drives you to the symposium contains more than 1,000 of semiconductors. And smartphone in your pocket contains more than 160 specially designed chips. These chips are incredibly complicated to design and produce, requiring thousands of production steps in the facilities that requires billions of dollars as a capital expenditure. Due to the complex dynamics of the industry, it's not practical and even helpful to equate the term economic of security as efforts to reduce all dependencies to achieve self-sufficiency. For example, the United States is by far the leading and most influential country in the industry. As far as I know, US-based companies are responsible for a majority of industry's overall revenues in semiconductor industry. It is also the largest consumption market, and at the same time, the kind of source of input technologies like design software, core IPs, and manufacturing facilities, manufacturing equipments. Korea also plays an important role in that ecosystem. It is, one of very few countries capable of producing leading-edge chips. And as you may know, Korean companies like SK Hynix is now providing most of memory products to the industry. As a company, we are now working very closely with and rely on US suppliers and customers. We do not see these partnerships and mutual dependencies as a negative. they strengthen economic security of both countries, United States and Korea. Preserving this partnership will become increasingly important as the industry faces technology kind of challenges. Actually, the future of the industry will be determined by the success of technology consortium rather than by an individual companies. For example, next generation semiconductor will require a new paradigm of how different types of chips can communicate with each other to solve the issues like computing bottlenecks and energy efficiency. That's the reason why U.S.-Korea collaboration or partnership based on our different capabilities in this industry is so important. Actually, the primary role of private sector in economic security is to ensure a reliable supply of our products, invent next generation of technology, create jobs, and enable economic growth. Our presence and ongoing investments in the United States and Korea reflect those goals. As we make more strategic investment, especially in the United States, we also look forward to being a reliable partner to policymakers in both the United States and Korea in their efforts. We encourage all of us to work together to strengthen the two pillars that supports economic securities, technology and economic partnerships. Personally, I believe that there is no better example of successful economic security partnership between United States and Korea than our shared semiconductor ecosystem. At a time of geopolitical volatility, we, the United States and Korea, must do all we can to protect and strengthen this critical relationship and partnership. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. No. And our final speaker, but not least, is Troy Stangaron. Troy is the Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute of America, and he's also a columnist for the Korea Times and a contributing editor for The Diplomat back in the United States. Previously, he was the POSCO Visiting Fellow at the East-West Center and an Asan Institute CFR International Affairs Fellow. And prior to that, worked on the Hill for then Senator Robert Torricelli on issues related to foreign affairs and trade. Mr. Stangaron, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Rexon. Thank you all, and especially thanks to Asan and the U.S. Embassy for making today possible. Similar to Wendy, it's my first time back in Korea since the pandemic began, so I'm excited to be here with everyone today. I'd like to sort of build on some of the comments that have been made and maybe flesh a few ideas out. We've seen a shift in recent years in the relationship. If we go back to the Moon-Biden summit, you can sort of see this really start to play out to where issues related to technology, the pandemic, and cooperation on issues like economic security are very much at the forefront of the relationship. And while North Korea is still within the context of the statements, these are really the issues that are dominating the relationship, and they're likely to be significant issues going forward. And when we think about this, evolving issues like artificial intelligence will be a key to the relationship, but also emerging technologies, metaverse, for example, or biotechnology. But these changes are also going to be driven by other factors. Demographics. We all know the situation in South Korea with the declining population and the extremely low birth rates in the last 4 years. Also, competition to secure resources. We talk about supply chains, electric vehicle batteries and things. How are we going to take and really meet the challenges that we're going to face to take and make this push into electric vehicles? All of these factors are going to keep pushing these issues to the forefront. And so in this context, I'd like to make 3 brief comments on some issues going forward. one on economic security and the idea that it needs to work both ways. One on that our cooperation needs to be not just bilateral, but also multilateral. And lastly, the role for the private sector within this type of cooperation. So I want to start with economic security. I largely agree with Anthony's definition. I just want to maybe try to flesh out a little bit more. I would call economic security where the intersection between economics and national security, and specifically how it impacts things such as trade, technology diffusion, and cybersecurity, because these are the kinds of areas where we're really seeing these things start to merge together. And so we've agreed at the recent summit, and our business communities as well have worked to take and try to make this happen, to move forward on things like the transition to electric vehicles. And so if we look at cooperation in this area, 12 of the 14 high-capacity battery factories that are going to be built in the United States between now and 2025 will be built by either South Korean firms or South Korean firms in joint ventures with US companies. Now, when we think about the demand for electric vehicles going forward, there are challenges to meet the goals that we've set for 2030 globally, or even just domestically in the United States and South Korea. To meet global expected demand for electric vehicles by 2030, in terms of minerals that will need to be mined and refined, we need to see lithium mining grow by 7 times what it is today. This is a significant jump. Lithium is relatively common, but we're going to need significant changes in terms of inputs coming in. If we look at cobalt, another key component, 2/3 of cobalt today is mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. China owns many of the most significant mines, or excuse me, has the mining rights to most of the significant mines in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so we're going to have to look for alternative sources, because at the same time, not only is China mining many of these minerals that we need, it's also the key country in which the processing for these minerals takes place. And so when we think about just simply things like electric vehicles going forward, secure supply chains means taking, one, not only building new inputs into the system in terms of where are we going to get the minerals, how are we going to refine them, but also how we do this in a way that is sustainable economically and environmentally. And so these are going to be key challenges going forward in terms of how we manage our economic security. Now, we've talked about semiconductors, and clearly that's an important role. We also saw in 2019 the situation where Japan changed its export controls on certain key chemicals that are necessary for the semiconductor industry. And this is where I'd like to transition to the idea that we need to think about this sort of multilaterally. There are going to be issues like semiconductors to where cooperation is going to entail bringing together South Korea, Japan, the United States, countries in Europe like the Netherlands, and there's going to be specific countries that will need to be working on these issues. And so while I think IPEF plays an important role in terms of a broad sense of cooperation within the region, we also need to think, as Anthony said as well, beyond the region and how we need to cooperate and where that cooperation needs to take place. Now, there's other areas to where the relationship will evolve, and climate change has been in both of the last 2 statements. South Korea, initially under the Moon administration and now under the Yoon administration, has put significant efforts into developing hydrogen. But when we think about this issue, how do we make hydrogen a commercial fuel and make it viable? To do that, I don't think this is something that South Korea can do on its own. I don't think it's something the United States and South Korea can do on its own. We need to look for partners and how to take and bring together countries who ideally make sense on this issue. And so if we look within, I'm going to use an older term, the Asia-Pacific region, I think if we work to combine the technology of South Korea, Japan, and the United States with the ability of countries such as Australia and Chile to produce green hydrogen, we can start to take and put together markets for demand for the technology, for places to use them, and really start to knit this together to try and make this a viable commercial initiative. And so we need to be thinking, once again, multilaterally. How do we take and pull these issues together? So the last thing I'd like to touch on is the private sector. We see the government driving a lot of the conversation on how we're going to take and create economic security, secure our supply chains, and other related issues, and governments will play an important role. But at the end of the day, the corporations and the private sector will be key in this as well. And so, for example, I've mentioned electric vehicle batteries. LG Chem is investing $9 billion in Indonesia to basically completely take and be able to mine, refine, and produce electric vehicle batteries in Indonesia to address these types of supply chain issues. But when we think about this, when we think about US cooperation with South Korea, the model in the United States where you have joint ventures for the plants is something we could also extend to the resource mining and the refining. So going forward, we need to think more in terms of how can our companies pair up in joint ventures so it's mutually beneficial and we're achieving our objectives. For some of these things, new technologies like the metaverse, we may need to look to startups who can try and take and build the new pathway into an area that we don't really know how this is going to develop yet. So startups and potentially startups that are still joint ventures between companies could be a key form of private sector collaboration going forward. The private sector will also play an important role on the research side. We talk about collaboration a lot, but I don't think we can forget competition. We want to make sure that the United States, South Korea, and our partners remain competitive globally, and so we need competition built into this. And so that means that we need to also encourage research and development. And if we look at Samsung, for example, they're working with Harvard University to try and develop a new semiconductor chip that will work similar to a human neural network. So this would be a new revolutionary type of technology. SK Hynix has invested research in 15 universities around the United States. So building our collaboration on our research sectors is going to be a key as well. And lastly, the private sector will be playing an important role in identifying these challenges when they come forward, because many firms will be the first to see where there's potential disruptions. And so creating an early warning system that incentivizes companies to share this information so that way we can all benefit is going to be critical. And so just to conclude, I'd like to say, going forward, the key parts of a relationship will be building an economic security framework that works for both countries, taking and working on these issues on a multilateral as well as bilateral area, and integrating the private sector in a way that will benefit both companies in South Korea and the United States. Thank you.
Okay. I've got a few questions that I will hopefully help to kick off a conversation, and then I will see what questions there are from the audience. But I want to start by picking up, Mr. Stangaron, from your last comments, and arguably from last three speakers, around highlighting the role of the private sector, which I think is qualitatively different today, as we recognize, in pursuing the objectives that the governments are laying out in these emerging and critical technologies that many of you have listed. Semiconductors, quantum, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, biomanufacturing. The drivers of innovation and entrepreneurial accomplishments are largely, not exclusively, but largely in the private sector. And this, to me, highlights, I think, one of the biggest structural challenges for us to achieve the kind of success we've laid out, because it requires this partnership, as is reflected in what our two leaders expressed a couple weeks ago, the public-private partnership to, I think the phrase they used in their joint statement was protect and promote critical technologies. And Mr. No, you highlighted some of the ways that you see this partnership playing a key role in how SK and SK Hynix helps foster this partnership. But I want to hear from other panelists here on where are the challenges to achieving this kind of partnership. I can see some of them. It's an area that many in government are not used to thinking about. How you bring in and how do you understand the decisions made by corporations in the private sector, where they invest, how they invest, what are the choices they make. Those are decision sets that are informed differently than public policy decision making. So if I might start, Ms. Cutler, with you, experience from the government, and Kim Jong-un to you.
Okay.
How do you see the challenges from your time in government in transitioning to facing today's and the set of challenges.
Wendy, you start first.
Yeah, so just a couple of points. I couldn't agree more. I think given these types of challenges, the input of the private sector is critical because governments don't really understand these technologies. But the question is, do governments trust the private sector enough with respect to economic security objectives? And we're seeing that in the United States. We really saw it more during the Trump years, where I think there was a feeling that, particularly when it came to China, that our companies were very willing to turn over technology to their Chinese competitors, or they were willing to overlook, longer-term implications of their business decisions to achieve short-term objectives. And I think there was kind of a tension that was built in that we are seeing now continuing, particularly in the export control world, investment screening world. And you have now our administration looking at outbound investment restrictions, which is a horrifying topic to the private sector. So I do see one big challenge is I'm not sure if the objectives are the same. I think that does create some tension. But second, the other point I would just bring to the table is we're all talking about input of business, right? And in the United States, when this administration talks about stakeholders, they're talking more and more about input from workers, that we put too much emphasis on business input, and we need to really up our game with respect to those who may be losing out from decisions made, particularly in the tech world. And so I would just conclude and say that I think when the administration now is going to come forward with their ideas on what a digital economy agreement would look like, it's not just going to be what's good for technology companies. We're going to see some new and innovative ideas that take consumer, worker, and other just citizen concerns into account.
Well, Roxanne, when you say market economy, in my mind, of course, that market should be led by private sector. If government led the market, that's not anymore market economy anyhow. That's very basic, But frankly, there were times when people think, and the government think, government is omnipotent. But with that kind of thought, we cannot respond to the new emerging challenges of today. So by saying that, why we need the partnership to be strengthened, to secure the economic security, particularly from the perspective of private sector, I have to first of all think about globalization has been challenged very severely by non-economic reasons and by division of countries or standoff, ideological standoff. And due to that, there's a broken down of supply chains here and there. Well, having said that, as a global circumstances, now many Korean companies with a good reputation are now rushing to the United States with their investment. And that may be the good example of strengthening partnership with the United States. And from the perspective of the US, that is very good for them, to secure the good supply of semiconductors and batteries for EVs. But here, as a person who has engaged in negotiations with other economies, I have to think about a kind of a behind, situations. Why Korean companies rush to U.S. Why nowhere else? If you look at 10 years ago, one good destination was a country south of border, very adjacent to U.S. That's under the paradigm of, or the scheme of what you call NAFTA 1. But with the Trump administration, now we have what you call USMCA, or some other people call it NAFTA 2, where any companies, Korean or other countries, once they try to maintain a certain portion in market share in US market, then they have to think about the rules, which is USMCA now, and which has jacked up, quite very high, the local content. So unless they set up a plant in US, then they cannot meet all those requirements. So there was a kind of a willy-nilly reasons. But anyhow, that's the circumstances, number one. Well, that's good. If the circumstances are given, then we have to rush to US. The problem is, the cost of setting up a plant is really, double, triple, quadruple higher than other places like I took examples, the south of border. Mm-hmm. So while it is true, they are taking investment to U.S., but at the same time they have to worry about their sourcing of financing. Number one. And number two, when I combine this question of partnership to be strengthened and to secure the economic security for any Korean companies who has a big business, they have one way or another a very important supply chain with China. No one can deny that. I look at an in-depth study which has been done quite lately, and there, the conclusion of that study was the researchers picked up a very vulnerable items. When I say items, that is products and parts or core minerals by HS code 10 digit. And they picked up 133 items, very vulnerable. But out of 133, 126 are from China. So once China may take a kind of coercive economic or trade measures against Korea or to a specific companies, then that can be a very practical concern and questions. So having said that, while we try to strengthen partnership and talking about economic security, then there should be a kind of a give and take, a real mutual cooperation. And for example, supply chain of core minerals, which has been already expressed in the presidential statement of the two presidents 2 weeks ago. Korea the land is very small, We can dig the ground, but it's very hard to find any core minerals here. But US has a big land. Maybe India, Australia, Brazil, they have a big land, a wide land, and potential of many mineral resources. Of course, there are problems. There's some challenges from environmentalists and the cost to be explored. But I think this is the time to think about the upstream kind of response, to this kind of challenge. If we really seriously think about secure the supply chain for important and critically important core minerals, not by lip service, but a real action, then we have to think about some activities in upstream to find our own resources. Of course, we can think about a kind of a special management or a long-term contract or early warning systems. These are all downstream measures. Mm-hmm. What I try to emphasize is let's go into a kind of a mutual cooperation in upstream. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I could follow up on that, but in the interest of time, I want to see if there are any questions from the audience here. Okay. I think there's a microphone coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been very, very stimulating to be present in this panel. I'm the ambassador of the Dominican Republic. My name is Federico Cuello. I've been generously given a small corner in the Korea Times to share some of the ideas I'm going to communicate now. And I fully agree that enlarging the theater for the discussion on economic security is the right approach. Clearly, economic security goes well beyond the reliable supply of critical minerals, and it's a key element, no question about it. Economic security goes well beyond the reliable supply of foodstuffs now that we're going through inflation and scarcity, especially as a result of the ongoing war in Ukraine. I think the approach we have in the Dominican Republic is that economic security is a key element for the resilience of the national economy so that we can withstand and recover future shocks. It's not that we want to isolate anybody. It's that the behavior of those actors has affected us, has provoked shocks that has disrupted our economies and the flows of transportation in the world, affecting all of us here. So we need dependable markets to ensure that the recovery continues and is not perturbed again. Latin America is ready to serve as a reliable market. We have a growing middle class, and whatever Korea and the US produce, we are ready to buy. Of course, it has to work both ways, as the former minister just said, and that's why we have free trade with the US, and 10 of us have free trade with Korea. Not yet the Dominican Republic, but I'm working on that. And the key element that hasn't been mentioned is the need to decentralize production as an essential element of that resilient supply chain that we need to strengthen in the future. And this is where nearshoring comes to play a role. In the Wall Street Journal now they're calling it friendshoring. And clearly, we need to be working in this nearshoring strategy with reliable partners that will be deserving of the trust that has been mentioned several times in the context of the bilateral relationship between Korea and the US. So we need a large supply of critical minerals. You can find all of those in Latin America: bauxite, ferronickel, copper, and many, many others, including in the Dominican Republic. We need reliable markets to ensure the recovery is long-lasting. We have that in Latin America. And you need countries to serve as a basis for decentralizing production through nearshoring. We are perfectly placed in Latin America, not only vis-a-vis the US, but also vis-a-vis the European markets. The Dominican Republic, for example, is 9 hours by plane from Europe, and less than 9 days by vessel. So for a Korean producer, locating their production facilities in the Dominican Republic can serve to attend both markets and have a reliable place from which to supply those markets when there is disruption elsewhere in the world. APEC countries already have a link to play. I mean, APEC exists before the idea of IPEF came up. And I think the last speaker mentioned the role that Chile and Australia can play in the hydrogen economy. I think this is a fantastic idea. But I think IPEF needs to be complemented by a new ATEF, an Atlantic Economic Framework that could square the circle, bringing Europe, bringing Canada, bringing the UK, and of course bringing all of those Latin American countries that are democratic and that share free trade agreements with the EU and the US. And I think this could be a way for us to ensure that we have a resilient world economy that can withstand future shocks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Well, you certainly picked up on a number of the themes of our panel. I invite any of our panelists to comment on the implications of shocks to economies from the disruptions, or this notion of widening the lens to think about other partners and countries. Mr. Kim?
Thank you, Lex. And just quickly, I'll combine this and then previous discussion. I think the question becomes, when we talk about PPP, who is in the front seat and who will be the driver? So this is not a joke, but I think we need to think about, rather than public-private partnership, this is time to think about private-public partnership. So private sector should be upfront, and they should be the driver, rather than government comes in, let's do this. If we do so, that's not much different from China's 5-year planning, where a long time ago, 20th century version of industrial policy. So if we want to really build up security and secure a well-functioning supply chain, I think private sector should be in the driver's seat, and the role of the government should be how to frame the parameters and the playground so that everybody can follow the same rule. It's in a way very similar to the situation we are having with China. So China is not really a private sector-driven economy. It's basically a government-driven, statist economy, and that's why we have this fundamental problem. So that supply chain issue, how to work together, I think we really need to think about how to really put forward the private sector. Fundamentally, I think supply-demand curve is really about demand and supply in the private sector, not driven by the government. Government has a role to play, but government is not the decider here. So I think that's the kind of fundamental framework we should, or we may, want to keep in mind.
I'd like to
Dr.
add to the Anthony's answer. Actually, that's what the new Korean government is putting the words, like the private sector in the front and the government actually in the back. I think it's very important to note that the difference between the policies that are related to the industrial commons that I mentioned before, with the industrial policies in the past. Actually, industrial policies actually was like the picking winners of the company or a industry. But the many countries are actually turning to something similar to the industrial policy, because as you mentioned, there are not, for example, China to the United States is not a market economy, and also, the market economy is maybe the best, but if everybody plays by the rule, and there's no issue regarding the fair competition. So I think in order to build the reliable and resilient supply chain across the region, I think we need to improve the cooperation in terms of the technology, investment, R&D, and human capital, all those areas. And also the government needs to provide some supporting, some support for the system, so that the private sector can actually bring some innovative activities with the system. And that's why I think the IPEP could be a very good framework to start with, and we can enlarge that to maybe the further to the other world, as Ambassador said. So I think we need to broaden the cooperation between Korea and the United States first, I guess, in the areas of the investment, and for example, like the R&D center and the consortium with the European countries, as Anthony also mentioned.
Thank you. I'm going to risk the wrath of my friends at Asan here to take one more brief question.
Thank you. My question is to Mr. No from SK Hynix. I'm Chung Min Lee from the Carnegie Endowment and also KAIST. Are you confident that you will not face competition from the Chinese as they ramp up their own semiconductor industry? And number two, what assurances do you have that Korean companies are able to beef up resilience? And I think the key lesson that we can learn is from Finland. Over the last 20 years, the Finns have done remarkable work in building resilience of companies to, for example, geopolitical threats. So as an SK man, I'm asking you, what's the competition from China, and what are you doing to beef up and to strengthen SK's resilience? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Actually, regarding your first question, actually, it is quite hard to say about the result from the efforts of Chinese government to reinforce their capability in semiconductor industry. As of now, they do have so many semiconductor-related companies like YMTC, Tsinghua Uni and CXMT like that. But they already invested a lot of money. It's really huge money. It's over than, for example, 20 to 30 billion US dollars in each company. But as of now, the result was not very successful as of now. But it's quite weird for us to think that Chinese players cannot catch up semiconductor technology in the future. Actually, the semiconductor technology has been invented in the United States, and it moved to Japan, and moved to Korea, and why not to China? Actually, it is quite natural for the technology to evolve across the globe, but it is quite interesting for me to see the Chinese government effort to increase the private sector, especially in semiconductor industry, by themselves. Due to the relationship between two big countries, as we see, Chinese players is now quite suffering from the lack of support from the global players. But in the long-term view, I'm sure that they will catch up the capability to make the chips. And at the same time, if we look at semiconductor manufacturing process, it requires making transistors at nanometer scales. But if we look at a value chain, it spans thousands of miles and multi-borders across the globe. So we cannot live alone. Even Chinese players cannot live alone, and United States players cannot live alone. So we have to collaborate each other for the mutual benefits. But due to the complicated situation from the politics, it is quite hard for me to talk about the future of Chinese players, especially in semiconductor industry. But I'm sure that they will catch up in the future.
Well, we're at time, and there's a lot more we could discuss. But please join me in thanking our panelists for a very rich discussion.